Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Donald Trump wants to bring down the price Americans pay for medicines. His most favoured nation policy does that by linking US drug prices to the lowest prices paid in comparable countries, and several EU member states are on that list. The policy is designed to bring down what Americans pay for medicines, but the ripple effects are landing in Europe. New data suggests that pharmaceutical companies are already reconsidering where and when they launch new drugs, with European patients potentially waiting longer or paying more. Christoffer Frendesen is an EU correspondent based in Brussels, covering health, pharma and life sciences policy for Dagens Pharma, with a background as a policy advisor in the European Parliament. In this episode, we look at what MFN means in practice for the European pharma industry, whether delayed launches are a real risk, what it could mean for pricing and market access decisions, and what the EU's policy response actually looks like from the inside. Christoffer, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Before we kick off, do you want to tell me a bit about yourself, actually, a bit about your background?
Yeah, well, you told most of it, I think, but I'm an EU correspondent here in Brussels. I work for different media covering energy, defense, and health. My primary focus, I would say, is probably on health. And recently I've been covering this area of most favored nation policy, as we'll talk about today. Apart from that, as you also mentioned, I'm a former advisor in the European Parliament. I worked for a Danish MEP, multiple Danish MEPs, but at least one of them throughout my time in the Parliament, so 5.5 years. So more than half a decade. So that's quite a long time to be within the EU institutions. I'm pretty sure most people would feel. And yeah, you learn a lot, but it was very, very interesting.
So let's get into it then. Obviously, it's early doors, but what will MFN actually change in practice for how drug prices are set in Europe?
Difficult to say at this point. It's still very uncertain what exactly it will mean. But I've talked to several companies and several interest organizations, and they all point to some of the same potential consequences of the MFN policy. The main ones being a risk of delayed launches of new medicines, or even for in some cases, maybe even scraping the launch of new medicines to European markets. And also, I've heard from multiple sources that a real risk is increasing medicine prices. So I think these are the three main potential consequences. And apart from that, of course, whatever the political response from European politicians will be, this will also affect how European patients and national health systems, how they will feel this policy.
So you've been tracking how companies are responding to this. What are you hearing?
In general, I'm hearing that the MFN policy creates a lot of uncertainty. Some would say even extreme uncertainty. So many European pharma businesses and companies are reliant on the US market for a lot of their profits, at least significant part of their profits. So this uncertainty creates or materializes rather in considerations on where to invest, the launch strategy of new medicines. And I also believe it results in a hell of a lot of meetings for management in many companies. So essentially what I'm hearing is that nothing is certain yet, but it definitely leads to considerations on potentially, as I said, delaying the launch of medicines, and potentially also considerations on if it's possible to increase prices.
It makes sense to me that prices might increase because, to sort of get that balance. But with delayed launches, why would that be impacted?
The idea is that the price in the US would be the same as some of the prices or chosen prices in similar countries, like high-income countries. Could be France, it could be Denmark, it could be the UK. And that would lower the prices for the medicines in the US significantly, because the US have much higher prices. I believe, of course it varies, but I believe in some cases it's like 3 to 4 times higher prices in the US compared to other markets. The reasons for that are many, but that alone, the big price difference, means that for European businesses, also for American or international pharma businesses or companies, this will have a huge impact if their prices are lowered in the US.
So they would just launch a drug in the Americas without the EU so that they didn't have to lower the prices for the EU, and they could just keep that higher price in America. I guess it makes more financial sense to keep the prices high because they're paying so much more and then just not release it in in the EU and take that sort of financial hit.
Exactly. I guess the hope is also that by delaying it, like then you can agree on a price in the US and then you can launch later in European countries, and thereby it might not affect the price in the US as much. But again, that is unclear. And I think, and this is just me speculating, but I think that is why some companies are even considering just scrapping launches in European countries.
So if they delayed the launch of the new medicine in Europe, what would the intention be there? Would it be to keep the prices comparable to the United States, or just to get around the MFN and have the high prices in America and lower prices in the EU?
I would guess that it would be to avoid lowering the prices in the US too much. I think with Trump's current push and also with the MFN agreements that he has made so far, it's clear that the Trump administration is demanding or coercing companies to lower their prices. But by making agreements, they hope that they can at least avoid as low prices as could potentially be if they were hit by actual most favored nation policy.
And so you recently covered a survey about this, about European SMEs. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. The survey found that a majority of small and medium enterprises, at least those who responded to the survey, that they were considering delaying the launch of medicines, as we talked about, and some of them even considered completely dropping the launch in some European member states. I said European member states. It was companies within Europe, but I think some of them would likely also be operating in the UK and other markets outside of the EU, of course. It's important to understand that for many of these SMEs, the US market is very profitable. They rely on the market for a significant amount of their profits. And the survey also showed that the biggest export country for a lot of these, I think actually the most of these SMEs, were the US. So the US is very important to them. The survey also reveals that respondents were more likely to pass on the cost from lower profit margins in the US to other markets. Of course, that could also include Europe.
How seriously should we take these responses? Is it companies flagging a genuine concern, or is there sort of an element of just sort of sending a message to policymakers?
I believe a lot of the companies are using this moment, this opportunity to send a signal to policymakers to say, hey, we need higher prices, otherwise we might not give you the medicines that you would like. That's definitely a possibility. It will depend on how the US end up codifying the MFN policy into law. But I've spoken to, as I said, several companies, but I've also spoken to experts recently. A professor called Helmut Brandt, he said that he believed businesses would still be able to invest in research and development of new medicines and treatment, even with prices in the US decreasing a bit. But then it would entail that these businesses would just accept a less profits and possibly also having less money for research and development. And they could do that, but it seems unlikely that it will just accept to be less profitable. Also because investment in research and development is so important within the pharmaceutical sector. It's important for sustaining your business and for ensuring your future as a pharma company. So it's unlikely that the companies will just accept a lower income, a lower profits. So it's very likely that there will be a significant push to increase prices in other markets, such as the European markets.
Let's talk about patient impact for a second. What would a delayed launch actually mean for a patient waiting for a new medicine?
Well, very basically, it means that they will get access to medicines later. It could be months, it could be years. For some patients, it might not change their life. It might not change too much. It's not always that new innovative medicine will have a huge impact for patients, but in some cases, it might make a significant difference. It could affect your quality of life, and also it could also have an impact in terms of curing deadly diseases. I cannot say definitely how it will affect patients, but there is definitely a possibility that this could affect patients in terms of quality of life and in terms of maybe even combating some very serious deadly diseases.
For me, it kind of makes me think of just those patients who maybe have tried multiple cancer treatments and sort of are coming to the end of their options. So they're potentially not having another option that could have been there for them without a delayed launch.
One thing that's also important to highlight, especially working within the EU, there is already a major disparity between between countries and access to medicines within the EU. Like some medicines are never really launched in some EU markets. So there is already a difference, but it's not something that affects like France or Germany, for instance. So there are major differences already, and some medicines are not launched, but this could make it even worse.
So why is that then?
Some of it is whether or not it's profitable, I believe, for some of the companies, or if it's worth it, like to be cynical about it. Some of the countries are fairly small, like very limited population, so some medicines they will just not reach that many patients within some of these small countries, and also some of these countries have very limited purchasing power, so the amount of money you can make in those markets are very limited. The EU is trying to address this in a number of ways, but it is difficult, especially because you have so many different healthcare systems within the EU. So there are major disparities, and it is a problem already, but it's trying to be addressed from the EU. And this MFN policy could make this disparity between the countries even worse.
That's really interesting. Let's continue to talk about the EU sort of as a whole. Probably easier for this conversation to unpack. Do you see a future where delayed launches could become the new normal for European markets in general?
I think it would depend on the future of the US MFN policy. It's unclear if the next administration after Trump will continue this kind of policy. There is a possibility that they would continue something similar to the MFN policy if it secures cheaper medicine prices for US patients. And then if they actually manage to secure cheaper medicine prices, it's unlikely that the next government, whoever it might be, that they will change policy completely. I think as we talked about, the medicine prices in the US are so much higher than in Europe and other markets. So there is definitely a problem in the US with very, very high prices. And they definitely want to address this. Not just the Trump administration, also future administrations will want to do something about this. And the Trump MFN policy is a simple solution. A much more complex solution would be to change the current system in the US, the current healthcare system and how it works, the pricing and reimbursements, all of this. And that is much more complicated, and that would demand much more of the current administrations and future administrations. So there is a possibility, if this works for the US, the MFN policy, that it will continue. But as many things within this topic right now, it's unclear.
So the survey that you mentioned also flagged that companies are considering shifting their production to the US. Is that driven by MFN, or do you think that's more of Trump's broader sort of reshoring agenda with making domestic manufacturing more attractive?
I think both things could be affecting. Like, one thing is the tariffs that Trump has placed on European and, well, the whole world almost. They definitely provide an incentive to move or relocate production to the US to avoid these tariffs. Apart from that, many of the MFN agreements that Trump has made with pharmaceutical companies, I believe it's at least 16 up until now, they include, we don't know the details of these agreements, but from what the administration has published so far, the agreements include promises of investments in local manufacturing. So both the trade policy, both the tariffs and also the MFN policy might affect businesses in terms of considering whether or not they should move production or relocate production or even packaging to the US.
Or sort of the perfect storm, isn't it? So concrete action at this point from the Commission seems limited. Why the hesitation?
That's a very good question. Recently, the Commission has informed me that it is monitoring the situation. It also said it was monitoring the situation back in October last year. So it's been monitoring the situation for quite a while. And according to the Commission, it is still too early to draw definitive conclusions. And that's correct. As we talked about here, a lot of this is clouded in uncertainty. So there's no definitive conclusions yet, but there are clear signals as what might happen. So I've been trying to figure out or trying to inquire among government representations in Brussels if they are pushing for the Commission to actually do something. It remains unclear so far. I haven't been able to figure that out. So I believe this also signals that this is a very controversial topic for governments, for government representations, and for the Commission itself. Also, seeing how the interaction with Trump has gone during the last year, I think the Commission is also hesitant to do anything because it could be taking the wrong way by the Trump administration. This is just me speculating, but I think that this could play a part also, but it's unclear.
And also, pricing and reimbursement in this industry sits with individual member states of the EU. Does that make a sort of coordinated European response quite difficult?
It makes it very complex, at least. And yeah, I guess that translates to difficult. A professor that I spoke to suggested that the MFN policy and the external pressure on the EU could materialize in the possibility that EU could establish one process for pricing and reimbursement. So instead of having 27 different processes, it could be just one process. This would allow better access to medicines across Europe, also in the smaller member states, and it would also make the EU a much more interesting market for pharmaceuticals because you're ensured access to many more patients, and you have a lot less administrative burdens to go through, a lot less bureaucratic hoops that you have to go through to be able to reach patients. So in that way, it could be interesting. However, it would demand EU countries to give up power, and that has historically been a dead-end road on health policies. It happened during COVID, though. EU countries were able to agree on jointly purchasing vaccines, but in general, just abandon the national processes and just having one EU process for pricing and reimbursement. That seems very difficult still at this point. And I would say it's very close to unlikely at this point, but things could change.
That'll be really interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, with raising European prices as a potential solution in pharma companies' eyes, is that politically viable?
It's hard for me to say definitively. Politically, it will be hard, for sure. It will be very unpopular amongst patients. Naturally, they will have to cough up more money. This is always unpopular. It would also demand increase in health costs nationally. And this would, of course, also be controversial for many European countries. And the reason is, like, at least within the EU, I'm not sure entirely about the UK, but within the EU, many countries are struggling bad with their public budgets. So increasing cost for medicines would be difficult to deal with, for sure. So if you try to simplify it, it could be a choice between having access to new medicines or accepting higher prices. And if that is the choice, of course, I believe many politicians would consider potentially accepting higher prices or trying to find a way to introduce higher prices if it means access to new medicines. And also, some surveys have shown that patients can accept higher prices if there is a transparent and good reason why. So it would demand a significant communication task from public officials. So it is possible, but it will be hard. Also because, as we talked about, we have 27 different member states within the EU and then other European countries. So it would be very difficult to just make prices higher. But it's everyone that I've spoken to, both businesses and experts, they say that it seems very likely that we will see higher prices in the EU and the rest of Europe.
So you spent 5 years inside the parliament. How does a policy shock like this actually look like from the inside? How does it translate into legislative action or not?
That is also a very good question. It takes concrete consequences before words and speeches are turned into policy. At least that's my experience. Brussels is very big on talk, but walking the talk is more difficult, as it is for most people, but it's also the case within politics. The Commission's response kind of confirms this, that it says that it's monitoring, but it's not really doing anything. At least it's not announcing that it's doing anything as of yet. So we haven't seen any policy reactions as of yet, but as soon as you start to see the consequence of the MFN policy in Europe, they will have to do something. The public pressure will increase. So by then they will have to do something. The question is, if they wait until the consequences are felt, maybe some people would consider that that's a bit late to react, but it's unsure yet. Within the parliament, the head negotiator of the Critical Medicines Act has defended proposals from the parliament for a much stronger criteria for procurement to incentivize establishing European manufacturing. These criteria demand, of course, like significant local production in the final products. It seems a bit bureaucratic, but he argues that it's necessary to not reshore, but at least establish or incentivize local production and manufacturing of medicines. However, it's very unpopular within the industry. I don't know if it's unpopular among the whole industry, but at least among some actors within the industry, it is very unpopular. So it's unclear if the parliament will be able to push this through in the future negotiations, but that is at least one case where there is a policy reaction to the MFN policy.
Is that the EU Critical Medicines Act you're talking about there?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Interesting, it seems to me, that domestic manufacturing is becoming a lot more popular. Do you see that sort of domestic manufacturing, whether it's, onshoring to the US or sort of the EU incentivizing domestic manufacturing, that it'll kind of move that way?
It is. Next week, the Commission is going to propose new procurement rules for the EU, and there's going to be a heavy focus on demand for local production or local manufacturing. And some countries have said that this will make public procurement more bureaucratic, extend administrative burdens for businesses, which is what the EU is currently trying to limit in many ways. But some consider it necessary, especially some countries consider it necessary to be able to build European resilience in areas that's deemed critical, for instance, medicines.
What would that look like for sort of how medicines actually get to patients, having sort of more domestic manufacturing?
I think in some ways it would increase prices for European patients, because things are more expensive to produce here in Europe than it is in China or India. I was talking to an expert who was pointing out that one of the criteria that the parliament proposes is to have the active substances within medicines to be produced within the EU. Currently, a lot of it is produced in India or China, and to have it produced within the EU would be much more expensive. Of course, the final product would then be more expensive, so that would also increase the cost of medicines. How it would look like in other ways, it's hard for me to say, but I don't know if it would demand subsidies, but state aid of some kind I think would be needed also for the industry to actually consider establishing manufacturing within Europe. They will need to know that it's not something that they'll just do for a few years and then the EU or countries will change policy. So they will demand certainty or guarantees, some kind of guarantees to be able to be willing to actually establish a manufacturing production here in the EU.
Yeah, because I think it's about 75% of APIs are currently manufactured outside of the EU for like within the EU, which is obviously a huge number. So it'll be interesting to see how, if we do start to see more domestic manufacturing, how that will sort of affect the chain sort of going down. What should pharma companies be watching for from Brussels then over the next year or so?
I think very simply, they should be watching for if the Commission will say or propose anything as a response to the MFN policy. I don't think that the Commission will come out necessarily and say directly, this is a response to Trump's MFN policy. They might be afraid that saying something directly opposing the MFN policy or related to the MFN policy would create friction with Trump, and for multiple reasons they would like to avoid that. But I think it will be clear if the Commission comes out and says anything to address the potential consequences of the MFN policy, that it will be clear that this is a response, even though they don't say it directly. Just another point that I would like to add also, a professor that I talked to emphasized the possibility that European companies could come together and kind of make a common front in terms of negotiating with Trump. So instead of just negotiating with him bilaterally, each company on its own, they could come together and try to make a deal with Trump in general. Also helping Trump, maybe finding a way of lowering medicine prices for American patients. It's at this point, it's not an approach that has been used, it seems, and as you see, many companies are signing these agreements, these MFN agreements with Trump's administration. It's not in the cards as of now, but it could be if this continues. But we'll have to see.
Finally, then, I know it's all just speculation at this point, but if you had to bet, are European patients going to feel this?
Bet would say yes. I don't know how much I would bet, but I would definitely bet a yes. It seems likely, as we talked about, that the launch of medicines might be delayed and prices might increase. I think these two potential consequences are very likely. If it also means that some medicines will not even reach some European markets, that's definitely also a possibility, but it's not as likely, perhaps. Though I believe it was Pfizer's managers in Pfizer, a high-level manager in Pfizer, went out a month ago or maybe 2 months ago and said that if Pfizer had to choose between lowering the prices in the US or just not launching their products in France, they would definitely choose to not launch their products in France. So I think this MFN policy will have consequences. And the question is more how hard European patients will feel it, how much will it affect them on the everyday basis. But I think delayed launch of medicines and prices is likely.
Interesting, great. Well, Christoffer, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me today. It's such an important topic.
Of course, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.